Silas Mercer slammed the courthouse doors open so hard the hinges screamed. He didn't walk out. He strutted the way men do when they've already decided the outcome and are just waiting for everyone else to catch up. 9 children stood in the mud below the steps, rain coming down in cold, relentless sheets, and Mercer looked at them the way a man looks at broken equipment he's decided isn't worth fixing. "Load them up," he said to his deputy. "Separately. We're not waiting anymore." The oldest boy, 12 years old, his boots held together with rope, stepped forward. "Can't split us up." Martha said, "We stay together." Mercer didn't even look at him. "Martha Vale is dead, son. What she said doesn't count for much now." If you've ever watched someone treat a child like an inconvenience, like a problem to be filed away and forgotten, you know the exact feeling sitting in your chest right now. That burning thing, that outrage you can't quite put into words. Stay with us. Subscribe to the channel and follow this story all the way through, because what happens next will remind you why some people in this world still deserve to be called good. Hit that like button and drop your city or country. In the comments, I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to that courthouse steps, because a man on a horse is about to make a decision that will cost him everything and give him back even more. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight by the time Elias Crowe rode into Blackwater Ridge. He hadn't planned to stay long. He never did. He came into town the same way he'd come into town for the past decade, alone, with a short list and a hard preference for getting back to his land before dark settled in. Supplies, maybe a word with the feed merchant about winter stock prices, and then back to the quiet, back to the predictable misery of a man who had learned to mistake solitude for peace. He was 41 years old. His face showed more of it than that, kind of weathering that doesn't come from sun. And wind alone, it comes from years of sleeping in an empty house and waking up to nothing that needs you. He had a good horse. He had decent cattle. He had about 300 acres of land that produced well enough when the weather cooperated. What he didn't have and hadn't had for 9 years, since the fever took his wife and their infant son in the same terrible week, was any good reason to care too much about any of it. He rode through town with his collar up and his hat pulled low, and he was almost past the courthouse when the deputy moved, and the movement was wrong enough that Elias pulled his horse to a stop without quite deciding to. There were children on the courthouse steps. 9 of them. He counted without meaning to. Old habit, the kind a man develops when he spent years accounting for livestock, equipment, heads, and tallies. 1, 2, a gap in height, 3 through 5, clustered together, 2 more at the edges and at the very bottom of the steps, sitting in the mud because she'd given up on standing, a tiny girl who couldn't have been more than 4 years old. They were soaked, every one of them, the kind of wet that goes through wool and settles into bone. The oldest a boy with his jaw, set at an angle that was trying very hard to look like it wasn't trembling, was standing at the top of the steps with his arms slightly out, like he was ready to block something, or someone. Elias looked at them and didn't immediately recognize what he was feeling, because he'd spent so long not feeling much of anything that the sensation was unfamiliar. It took him a moment to place it. It was recognition, not of their faces, of the specific way they were holding themselves. Stillness, the resignation that sits in the body of someone who has already decided not to cry because they've learned that crying doesn't change anything. He'd worn that same stillness himself. Once he knew its weight. He was still sitting on his horse, water running off the brim of his hat, when Silas Mercer came back out of the courthouse with papers in his hand and that particular expression on his face, the expression of a man who has made a decision and is now executing it and doesn't want anyone asking questions about the decision. "You there," Mercer said, not to Elias, to the deputy. "The Aldrich place will take the 2 youngest boys. Get them moving." The oldest boy on the steps, Elias would learn his name, was Calder made a sound that wasn't quite a word. It was the sound of someone who has been arguing for a long time and has run out of arguments but hasn't run out of fight. "You already," said the Aldrich place. "I told you Thomas can't go there. He doesn't sleep right in new places. He needs. Boy, Mercer's voice went flat. I am not interested in sleeping arrangements. He's 7 years old. I'm aware of how old he is. Then act like it matters. Mercer stopped moving, turned slowly, and looked at Calder, the way men look at a dog that's barked one time too many. It was a specific kind of look, not angry. Exactly. More like assessment. The look of someone deciding how much force is necessary. Elias dismounted. He didn't know why he did it. He told himself later it was because his horse needed a rest. That was not the reason. He tied off at the post and walked toward the steps, mud pulling at his boots, rain still hammering down. Up close, the children were worse. There were dark circles under eyes that should have been sleeping soundly. The small, girl in the mud had her thumb in her mouth with the expression of someone who has stopped expecting the adults to do anything useful. Mercer glanced at him. Can I help you? What's happening here? County business. Nothing that concerns you. These children concern me. Mercer looked at him more carefully. You're Crowe, aren't you? The cattleman. Out past Miller Creek. That's right. Well, Mr. Crowe, these children were under the guardianship of a woman named Martha Vale, who passed 6 days ago. The county is now responsible for their placement, and I am executing that placement. It is not a complicated situation. How many homes? Mercer blinked. Beg your pardon. How many homes are you splitting them into? There was a pause. Mercer shifted his papers. 7, possibly 8, given the ages involved and available capacity in the county. 7 different homes. The circumstances are what they are. Elias looked at the children. Calder was watching him with the flat, careful expression of someone who had watched a lot of adults have a lot of conversations that didn't end well. One of the middle children, a girl, maybe 9, with her hair in 2 uneven braids that she'd clearly done herself, had taken the hand of the boy next to her. The girl in the mud hadn't moved. How long have they been out here? Elias asked. That's not relevant. It's raining, Mr. Crowe. How long? Mercer's jaw tightened. Since this morning. We've been working to finalize arrangements. These things take time. Since this morning. Elias looked up at the sky. It was past 3 in the afternoon. He looked back at the children, and the oldest boy, Calder, was still watching him. Not with hope. Elias noticed that. There was no hope in it. It was the look of someone collecting information, filing it away, preparing for the next disappointment. That look, more than anything else, was what did it. Who authorized the split? I did. Under county emergency provisions. Can it be countermanded? Mercer stared at him. Only if someone with appropriate means and standing agreed to take responsibility for all 9. The word landed in the wet air between them. Mercer heard it. Calder heard it. The girl with the uneven braids heard it, and her hand tightened on the boy beside her. All 9, Elias said again. What does that take? Legally. Mercer opened his mouth, closed it. He looked at Elias the way people look at a man who has just said something they can't quite categorize, trying to determine if it was a joke, a misunderstanding, or something they'll have to deal with. Mr. Crowe, you are a single man. I'm aware of that. With, as I understand it, a single-room cabin. That's accurate. 9 children, I can count. Of varying ages, some with significant needs. What kind of needs? Mercer blinked again. He'd been dealing with people all day who were trying to get out of things, and he had no mechanism prepared for someone trying to get into something. The youngest girl, Nell, the one on the ground there, she's 4. She doesn't speak much. We don't know if it's developmental or grief. The doctor wasn't certain. Thomas, age 7, has trouble sleeping. The twins, Boyd and Ray, age 10, have a history of running away from placements. Calder, he nodded at the oldest boy, is 12 and has made it clear to everyone who will listen that he intends to keep this family together by whatever means necessary, which has not made him popular with prospective placements. Elias looked at Calder. Calder looked back. What about the others? Elias said, Pearl, age 9, Henry, age 8, Dot and June, age 6, their sisters, and Nell. 9 names. 9 children. 9 separate little catastrophes that the county was about to scatter to the wind. Elias looked down at his boots. He thought about his cabin. 300 square feet maybe, one table, one stove, one bed that hadn't had another person in it for 9 years. Thought about the way the place sounded at night. Nothing. The wind sometimes. The cattle, if something startled them. Nothing else. He thought about his wife, Emma. He didn't do that often because it was a particular kind of pain, not sharp, after all this time, but heavy. She'd wanted a large family. Had talked about it the way some women talk about weather or season as a plain fact of the future. They'd been working toward it, and then they weren't. He hadn't thought about children in years, had trained himself out of it, and then little Nell slipped. She'd been trying to stand up from the mud, bracing herself on one hand, and her hand slipped and she went down again, and she made a small sound, not even a cry, just a sound. The sound of a child who is too tired to be surprised by one more thing going wrong, and she sat back in the puddle and looked at nothing. Elias walked down to her. He crouched in the mud beside her, not caring about his pants, and he said, "Hey." She looked at him. Her eyes were dark and serious, and they had that same quality the other's eyes had, that waiting stillness, that careful measurement of whether this adult was going to be useful or not. "You want to get out of the mud?" She didn't say anything. After a moment, she lifted her arms. He picked her up. She weighed almost nothing. She put her head on his shoulder without ceremony, the way children do, when they're too exhausted to perform distrust, and she was shivering so badly he could feel it through his coat. He stood up and turned to Mercer. "I'll take them," he said. "All 9 today." Silence that followed was a specific kind of silence, the kind that happens when a room has been going one direction, and something has changed the direction so completely that everyone is still moving the old way through sheer inertia. Mercer stared at him. Calder stared at him. The girl with the uneven D's pearl, he was already filing that away, made a sound that might have been the beginning of something she stopped herself from finishing. "Mr. Crowe." Mercer's voice had shifted into the tone people use when they're trying to be patient with someone, they think, isn't thinking clearly. "I appreciate the impulse. Truly. But you cannot be serious." "I'm standing in the rain holding a 4-year-old, Elias said. "I'm serious. You have no wife, no help. Your property, by all accounts." "Is mine," Elias said. "Free and clear. No debt, 300 acres. Good well. Cattle that'll bring enough to build with." "Build. I'll need a bigger house." "I know that. You'll need—" Mercer stopped, pressed 2 fingers to his forehead. "Mr. Crowe, this isn't a question of property or money alone. These children have needs, complex, varying, significant needs. Calder alone has been removed from 2 placements this year for refusing to cooperate with arrangements he didn't agree to. He was trying to keep his family together," Elias said. Calder's expression did something then. It was subtle, a small shift around the eyes, the kind that happens when someone says something you'd stopped expecting anyone to say. That's Mercer searched for the right word. "That's one way to look at it. It's the right way, Mr. Crowe. The legal process for my— What do you need from me? Right now. Today. What do you need to let me take them home?" Mercer looked at him for a long moment. He was a bureaucrat, not a bad man. Elias could see that, even through the frustration. He was a man doing a difficult job with insufficient resources, and he'd been doing it all day, and he was tired. And now this rancher, with a child on his shoulder, was asking him to throw out the plan he'd spent a week constructing. "I need your word," Mercer said finally, "in front of witnesses, and I need you to come back inside and sign papers." "Fine. And I need you to understand that if this goes wrong, if in 3 months those children are worse off than they would have been." "I understand. I will come out there personally, Mr. Crowe. I'd expect nothing less." Another pause. Mercer looked at the children. He looked at Nell. Asleep on Elias's shoulder, she'd fallen asleep, just like that, in the time they'd been talking. Something in Mercer's face shifted. Not much. Just enough. "Get them inside," he said quietly, "out of the rain. Then we'll do the paperwork." Elias turned to the children. They were all watching him. 8 faces. Nell was asleep with 8 different expressions layered over the same foundation. Guarded, careful, not ready to believe yet. Calder stepped forward. She does that, he said, nodding at Nell. Falls asleep fast when someone's carrying her. She used to do it with Martha. All right, Elias said. He didn't know what else to say. He wasn't a man who had words for things like this. Come on, then. He walked up the steps and through the courthouse doors, and after a moment that felt like it lasted longer than it actually did, 8 children followed him. They dripped on the floors, and the deputy looked annoyed, and Mercer went to find the papers, and Calder stood beside Elias, the whole time, with that careful expression still on his face, watching and measuring, deciding whether this was real. Why are you doing this? He finally said, quietly so only Elias could hear. Elias thought about that question. He could have given the simple answer, because it was the right thing, because someone had to, because he couldn't walk away. All of that was true, but that wasn't really it. I had a family once, he said. Lost them. Spent a long time after that, not knowing what to do with the space they left behind. Calder was quiet. Doesn't mean I know what I'm doing, Elias added. I'm going to burn breakfast. I'm probably going to say the wrong things at the wrong times. I don't know how to braid hair, and I've never helped anyone with their schoolwork. Then why? Because I've got space, Elias said, and you need it. And that seems like enough of a reason. Calder looked at him for a long time. Then he looked away, jaw working. Martha used to say that, he said, that sometimes one good reason is enough. Elias looked down at the sleeping girl on his shoulder, top of her damp head, at the way her small fist had closed around the front of his coat without her even waking up to do it. Sounds like she was right, he said. Mercer came back with the papers, and outside the rain was still falling, and none of the 8 children sitting on courthouse benches said a word because they were all doing the same thing, waiting to see whether this was the kind of thing that held or the kind of thing that fell apart. Elias picked up the pen and signed his name. 143, Part 2 bắt đầu viết nghệ không giới thiệu lại nhân vật hay thông tắt phần trước. Tiếp nối mạch truyện liền mạch từ phần 1. Viết đủ 6,000, giữ nguyên tất cả các yêu cầu về phong cách, cấu trúc và kỹ thuật kể chuyện như phần 1. The wagon ride back to the ranch took 2 hours, and it was the longest 2 hours of Elias Crowe's life. He'd borrowed the wagon from Harlan Briggs at the livery, couldn't fit 9 children on a horse, obviously. A fact that had not fully occurred to him until he was standing outside the courthouse with 9 children and 1 horse. And Harlan had looked at him with an expression somewhere between admiration and the specific concern people, reserved for men who've done something irreversible. You sure about this, Elias? No, Elias had said honestly and climbed up onto the seat. The children arranged themselves in the wagon bed with the practiced efficiency of people who had moved before. They knew how to fit into small spaces. They knew how to sit without complaining. Calder positioned himself at the back, legs hanging over the edge, watching the road behind them the way a boy watches for something he's afraid might follow. The twins Boyd and Ray, identical, down to the way they held their mouths pressed together in the middle. Pearl kept June and Dot on either side of her, a hand on each. Henry sat alone near the front with his arms on his knees, looking at nothing in particular. Nell stayed on Elias's lap. She'd woken up when they moved from the courthouse to the livery, looked around once with those serious dark eyes, and then simply stayed where she was. She weighed about as much as a bag of grain. Less, maybe. He held the reins with one arm and kept the other around her, and tried not to think too hard about what he'd just done. The rain let up somewhere around the first mile out of town. The clouds thinned but didn't break. The road was mud from edge to edge, and the wagon wheels tracked through it with a sound like something being slowly torn. Nobody talked for a long time. Then Thomas, 7 years old, the one Calder had tried to advocate for, on the courthouse steps said, from somewhere in the middle of the wagon, "Is there food?" Elias had not thought about food. "We'll figure it out when we get there," he said. A pause. "What's there?" Thomas asked. Reasonable question. Elias thought about his cabin, the single room, the single bed, the table with 2 chairs, the stove that worked when it wasn't being difficult. The shelf with about 4 days of supplies for one man, which was now meant to feed 10 people. A stove, he said, and a roof. Another pause. That's it, Thomas said. For now. He heard Calder, from the back, say quietly to Thomas, "It's enough for now. Stop asking." Thomas stopped asking. The last mile to the ranch, Pearl leaned forward and said to Elias, in a voice that was careful and precise, and clearly belonged to a child who chose her words deliberately, "We're not going to be any trouble." "You're 9 children," Elias said. "You're going to be some trouble." She frowned. He got the impression she'd prepared the reassurance and didn't know what to do now that it hadn't landed the way she'd intended. "I just mean," she said, "we know how to work. All of us." Martha made sure. "Good. Calder can do most things. Henry's good with animals. I can cook if you show me where everything is. The twins are strong. Dot and June can Pearl." She stopped. "You don't have to pitch me on keeping you," he said. "I already signed the papers." She was quiet for a moment. Then people changed their minds. He had no answer for that because she wasn't wrong. People did change their minds. He knew she knew. All of them knew that signed papers didn't mean permanence, didn't mean security, didn't mean that the bottom wouldn't drop out again. They'd had a guardian once. They'd had Martha, and Martha had died. He didn't make her a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. He just drove. When the cabin came into view, he felt them all shift, that collective readjustment that happens when people who've been bracing themselves finally see the thing they've been bracing for. It was not impressive. 1 room, a porch that needed 2 boards replaced, a barn that was in better shape than the house, honestly, because Elias had always maintained what was necessary for the cattle and let the living quarters take their chances. A well that worked. A stretch of fenced pasture beyond. Boyd said, very quietly, to his brother, "It's small." Ray said, equally quietly, "Shut up." Elias set the brake and climbed down and lifted Nell to the ground, and she stood in the mud beside the wagon wheel and looked at the cabin with the same expression she'd used on everything else, that measuring, patient look that seemed too old for her face. "All right," Elias said, "come on." He didn't know what he'd expected. Some kind of order, maybe. An orderly filing in. Instead, the children poured off the wagon in their own arrangement. The twins dropped off the back before it had fully stopped. Henry went straight to the barn, because there was apparently something in him that simply moved toward animals. Pearl helped June and Dot down carefully, while simultaneously watching Elias to see what he would do. And Calder was last, dropping to the ground and standing apart from the group with that slightly too old posture he carried everywhere. Elias opened the cabin door. They all crowded to look. The silence that followed was the specific silence of people trying to find something polite to say. The cabin was clean. He'd always kept it clean. A habit from the military years before the ranch, the kind of habit that calcifies into compulsion when a man lives alone long enough. But it was 1 room. 1 room with a table barely big enough for 2, a stove, a bed, a trunk, 3 shelves, and a window on the south wall. Thomas walked in, turned around once, and said, "Where do we sleep?" "Working on that," Elias said. "Tonight? Tonight we make do." He didn't have 9 bedrolls. He didn't have anything close to that. What he had was 1 blanket on the bed, 2 more in the trunk, a horse blanket in the barn that was clean enough, and about 4 hours until dark. He turned to Calder. "What do they need most right now?" Calder looked at him, still doing that measuring thing. "Thomas needs to eat before he gets worse," he said. "Nell needs to stay warm or she gets sick. Pearl won't say it, but she's been holding June and Dot together all day and she needs to sit down." He paused. "The twins are fine. They're always fine until they're not, and then it's fast." Elias absorbed this. "What about you?" Calder looked away. "I'm 12. That wasn't the question." A long pause. "I need to know we're staying," Calder said finally. His voice was level, controlled. A 12-year-old who had been practicing control for a long time. "I need to know this isn't. I need to know you're not going to decide in a week that it's too much." Elias looked at him directly. "I don't know what I'm doing," he said. "Told you that already. But I don't quit." "How do I know that?" "You don't." Not yet. Another pause. Calder nodded once, tight and contained, and went to help Pearl get the younger ones settled. Elias went to figure out dinner. What he had: half a sack of flour, some salt pork, dried beans that needed soaking, 3 potatoes, a jar of preserves that had been on the shelf long enough that he'd stopped noticing it, and coffee. Not enough. Not close to enough for tonight, and catastrophically not enough for tomorrow. He stood looking at his shelves for a moment, doing the arithmetic, and then Pearl appeared at his elbow. "The beans won't be ready tonight," she said, looking at the shelf with him. "No, salt pork and potatoes. I can make that work if you have a pan big enough. I have 1 pan. Enough for all of us?" He looked at the pan. It was not enough for all of them. "I'll get more from town tomorrow." "What about tonight?" "Small portions." She looked at him sideways. "The little ones won't understand small portions. They'll have to. June cries when she's hungry. Not to be difficult. She does." He rubbed the back of his neck. This was already not going well, and it had been 4 hours. "Is there anything else in the barn?" Pearl asked. "Sometimes Martha kept extra stores in the—" "No," he said. "Then wait." He thought about the back corner of the barn. There might be cornmeal. There was cornmeal, and a forgotten tin of molasses that he'd bought 2 summers ago, for some purpose he couldn't now recall. Pearl took stock of the additions with the expression of a small general revising a battle plan, and she told him what to do, and he did it. And by the time the light outside had gone fully gray, there was food on the table. Not much. Not good, exactly. Cornmeal mush and salt pork and the 3 potatoes sliced thin to go farther. The molasses in the center of the table as a kind of concession to sweetness. The 9 children crowded around his small table. They didn't all fit. The twins and Calder stood with their bowls at the edge because there weren't enough chairs. Nobody complained about this. They ate with the focused efficiency of children who had learned not to take food for granted. Nell ate everything in her bowl and then looked at the pot. Elias gave her the rest of his. Calder saw that and said nothing, but Elias saw him see it. After dinner, the impossible question of sleeping arrangements. Elias gave the bed to the 4 youngest: Nell, June, Dot, and Thomas, who fit in it like a litter of exhausted animals, asleep within 10 minutes. Pearl took the floor beside the bed. Henry went to the barn voluntarily and came back with the horse blanket and the information that the hayloft was warm if you didn't mind the smell. The twins took him up on this immediately. Calder sat by the stove. Elias offered him the last blanket. Calder accepted it without words, wrapped it around his shoulders, and sat with his back against the wall and his chin on his knees, staring at the stove. Elias sat in the other chair and did the same. At some point close to midnight, Calder said, "Not sleeping." "No. Thinking about what you did." "Doing the arithmetic," Elias said. "Feed for winter. What I'll need to build. How fast I can sell 2 steers without taking a loss on the price." Calder was quiet. "Did you have a plan?" he asked. "Before. When you said you'd take us." "No. Just did it. Just did it." Another silence. The stove ticked. Outside something moved in the pasture cattle shifting, or wind, or nothing. "Martha did that sometimes," Calder said. "Said she didn't think about it too hard, or she wouldn't do it. She sounds like she was a practical woman." "She was hard," Calder said. "Not mean. Just she didn't have extra. Extra time, extra money, extra patience. But what she had, she gave. She didn't pretend." He paused. "I liked that about her." Elias nodded. "How long were you with her?" 3 years. "Before that, 2 different places." "Before that." Calder stopped. "Before that doesn't matter." Elias didn't push it. They sat in silence until the boy's head dropped, and he jerked himself awake and dropped again. Elias waited until Calder had fully tipped sideways against the wall, asleep by sheer exhaustion, and then he put another piece of wood in the stove and sat back down. He had signed papers for 9 children. He had 1 pan, 1 room, 3 blankets, a dwindling supply of cornmeal, and a house that needed to become 3 times its current size before winter. He sat in the dark and thought about Emma, about the way she'd talked about children, not abstractly, but specifically. This many, this arrangement, A house that sounds like people, she used to say. I want a house that sounds like people. His house had been silent for 9 years. It was not silent now, even asleep. 9 children filled a space differently than one man. Small sounds breathing, a murmur, someone shifting, Thomas making a sound in his sleep that was almost a word, the particular aliveness of other people taking up space. Elias sat in his chair until the earliest gray of morning started through the window, and then he put his coat on and went out to deal with the cattle, because the cattle still needed dealing with regardless of what else was happening, and some things didn't wait for a man to figure himself out. The first week was a sequence of failures, some of them small and some of them significant. He burned the first 3 breakfasts. Not badly, not ruination, but badly enough that Henry made a face, and Thomas said, "What is that smell?" with the directness only 7-year-olds have, and Pearl took over with a patience that made Elias feel, for the first time in memory, genuinely incompetent. He didn't know how to arrange a household for 10 people. His systems, one-man systems, built up over years of solitude, dissolved instantly and didn't rebuild cleanly. Where did things go? Who was responsible for what? He'd run cattle operations with clear hierarchy and clear roles, but children weren't cattle. And when he tried to approach the domestic situation with the same organizational logic, Pearl gave him a look that suggested she found this approach both understandable and insufficient. "You can't just assign tasks by age," she told him. "Why not?" "Because Thomas will refuse anything with the word task in it, and June is actually faster than Dot, even though she's younger, and Boyd will do anything you ask him to as long as Ray isn't there, and if Ray is there, they both do nothing because they compete instead of cooperate." Elias stared at her. "How do you know all that?" Pearl looked at him as if the question was genuinely baffling. "Because I watched." He started watching. It took several days of observation conducted alongside the entirely non-optional work of keeping the ranch running before he began to see the shapes of them. Not the surface. He'd seen the surface on the courthouse steps in the wagon at the table. He was starting to see the underneath. Thomas, 7, was terrified of new places at night. Not a general fear, specifically the dark and unfamiliar spaces. In Martha's house, he'd had a particular corner he slept in. In Elias's cabin, he found the spot closest to the stove and claimed it without discussion, and Elias rearranged the furniture slightly without making a thing of it. The second night, Thomas slept through. The twins were not identical in the way Elias had first thought. Boyd was quieter, more watchful, more likely to finish a task without being asked a second time. Ray was the talker, the one with opinions, the one who pushed edges to see what they were made of. Put them together on a job and they argued constantly and produced excellent work. Separate them, and Boyd became sullen and Ray became reckless. Calder had figured this out long before Elias did. Henry didn't talk much. He didn't need to. He went to the barn the second morning and came back with the information that 2 of the fence posts on the east side needed replacing before they fell on their own. He was right. He'd also, without being asked, reorganized the tack in the barn into an arrangement that was more logical than what Elias had maintained for a decade. "Where'd you learn that?" Elias asked. Henry shrugged. "Makes sense." June and Dot were a unit. They didn't function separately and didn't seem to want to. What affected one immediately translated to the other, not through mimicry, but through something deeper, genuine sensitivity to each other's states. When June cried, which she did when hungry or frightened or overwhelmed, Dot was always there before anyone else. Not to fix it, but simply to be present. Elias, who had grown up around men who treated emotion as a problem to be solved, found this slightly bewildering and completely adequate. Pearl was managing them all, and had been managing them all, probably since before Martha died. She was 9 years old, and she was exhausted in the way people get exhausted when they've been responsible for things they shouldn't have to be responsible for. Elias saw it in the way she held herself at the end of the day, the slight loosening that happened when she thought no one was watching, and he started intercepting her taking over dinner so she could sit asking Calder to do the thing she was about to do herself, creating small spaces where she didn't have to be in charge of anything. She resisted this at first. You could feel the resistance the way she'd start to relax and then pull back, as if rest was something she didn't quite trust. He didn't push. He just kept creating the spaces. And Calder was the one who occupied Elias's thoughts most, in the quiet of early mornings before anyone else was awake. Because Calder was 12 years old, and he had taken on the full weight of responsibility for 8 other children, had been carrying it for God knows how long, and he didn't know how to put it down. Didn't know if it was safe to put it down. Every morning, Elias came back from the cattle to find Calder already up, already having done something, started the fire, checked on the little ones, assessed the day's requirements with a thoroughness that was not the behavior of a child. One morning, Elias came in from the pasture and found Calder mending a tear in June's dress. Sitting at the table in the early light, squinting at the small stitches, his tongue pressed between his teeth with concentration. "Where'd you learn that?" Elias said. "Martha, you're good at it." Calder shrugged. "You don't have to do all of it," Elias said. "Someone does. That someone doesn't have to be you. Not every time." Calder set the dress down and looked at him with that carefully level expression. "Been here 2 weeks. 2 weeks isn't long enough to stop being careful." Elias sat down across from him. "No," he said, "it's not. So I'll keep doing what I do. Until it's longer." "Fair enough." They sat in the early morning quiet, and Calder picked the dress back up and kept sewing, and Elias poured 2 cups of coffee. He'd started making the second one without thinking about it and pushed one across the table. Calder looked at the cup on 12. "Mostly water," Elias said. After a pause, Calder picked it up. The money was going faster than Elias had planned for, and he had not planned well to begin with. Food alone had tripled what he'd been spending. Children ate more than he'd calculated, not extravagantly, not wastefully, but consistently and multiply, and the arithmetic of 10 people was not the arithmetic of 1. He'd made 2 trips to town in the first 2 weeks, both times returning, with the wagon bed heavier and his account lighter, and Harlan Briggs at the livery had looked at him with an expression that said clearly that he thought this situation was temporary. He wasn't the only one. Word had gotten around Blackwater Ridge with the speed that only frontier gossip achieves. Elias Crowe, the solitary rancher out past Miller Creek, had taken 9 children off the county's hands. People had opinions about this. I heard some of them on his trips to town, not directed at him, but audible enough that they were meant to be the conversations that happen in the middle distance, with voices slightly louder than the speaker knows. Heard he's already struggling. 2 weeks, and the man can't manage it. It's charity work and nothing else. He'll bring them back before snow. 9 kids. Crowe, can you imagine? He can barely manage himself. He ignored them. He'd spent years being ignored by the town and had grown accustomed to the flow going both ways. But the money was real. The shortage was real. He sat with the figures 3 times, and they said the same thing every time. At this rate, with no significant additional income before winter, he would run out before spring. He needed to sell cattle, but cattle prices had softened. He needed to work more hours, but there were only so many hours, and 9 children occupied a significant portion of them. He needed help that he couldn't afford and couldn't ask for without admitting to a difficulty he wasn't prepared to admit. He was working through the figures one evening when Pearl appeared beside him and looked at the ledger. He didn't cover it. She studied it for a long moment. "You're short," she said. "I know." "How short?" "Enough to matter. Not enough to be a crisis yet." "What are you going to do?" "Sell 2 steers. Try to get decent price. Take on any additional work the county's offering. Start building before the ground freezes." Pearl frowned. "If you're short on money, why are you starting to build?" "Building costs. Because I need more space before winter. We can't fit 10 people in one room through a Kansas winter. It's not livable." "It's livable," Pearl said. "Not for 5 months." She was quiet for a moment, turning this over. "What if we helped?" she said. "You are helping. You're running the kitchen." "I mean with building." Calder and Henry, and even the twins they could do more than you're letting them. Elias looked at her. They're children. They're strong, Pearl said, in that precise, careful voice. And they know it, and they need to know it matters. That they're not just passengers, they're part of this. He sat back in his chair. He hadn't thought about it that way. He'd been thinking in terms of what was appropriate for children, which was a concept he'd been building as he went a construct mostly assembled from what he imagined Emma would have wanted. Don't burden them. Don't make them labor. Give them childhood. But Pearl was looking at him with 9-year-old eyes that had seen considerably more than childhood. Let us help, she said, really help, not just inside work. Thought about it. Calder and Henry on framing, he said slowly. Twins on hauling. You manage supplies and the little ones. Pearl nodded, already calculating. I'll need to show Calder some things, Elias said. He hasn't built before. He learns fast. I know. He also won't admit when something's too heavy. You'll need to watch for that. Elias almost smiled. He caught it before it fully happened. I noticed, he said. The building started on a Monday, with ground still soft enough to work, but the smell of approaching cold already in the air. Elias marked out the foundation with stakes and string, and Calder watched every step with that concentrated attention he gave to anything mechanical, and by the afternoon the boy was driving stakes with a precision that required almost no correction. Henry discovered a gift for figuring load-bearing angles that Elias would not have guessed from a boy his age. He'd hand Elias a piece of lumber, say this one's got a check in it, halfway down, and be right. He could feel problems in materials, the way some people feel weather changes, and Elias stopped second-guessing him after the third time. The twins were, as advertised, strong and competitive. Elias learned to frame work as a race, this pile of boards to there, before the other one gets his done, and they moved material in half the time it would have taken alone. The work was slow. There were days where the children had school. Pearl had made this non-negotiable in her quiet, implacable way, and Elias hadn't argued because she was right, and the building sat unfinished in the wind. And he stood and looked at it and did the arithmetic about cold and time and money again. One afternoon in early October, Silas Mercer rode out. Elias saw him coming from the pasture fence and walked in slowly, not rushing, which was a choice. By the time he reached the cabin, Mercer had dismounted and was standing near the construction site, looking at the framed walls of the addition with an expression that was difficult to read. Mr. Crowe, he said, Mercer, this is further along than I expected. Elias didn't say anything. Mercer turned and looked at the children, several of them visible, Henry and the twins working on the near wall, Pearl visible through the cabin window. He started and stopped. They look what? Healthier than they did. He said it like a man revising his assessment mid-sentence. A month ago they were... He shook his head. How are they actually? Honestly, Elias considered this. Calder still doesn't sleep well, he said. Thomas had 3 bad nights last week. Pearl doesn't stop moving unless I make her. Nell still doesn't talk much. He paused. They're also building a house and eating regular, and they know the name of every cow I own, because apparently Henry told them all, and there was some kind of quiz. Mercer looked at him. There was a quiz, he said. Ray won. Boyd is still bitter about it. A silence. And then Mercer did something Elias hadn't expected. He laughed. A short, genuine laugh, like something that escaped before he decided to let it. I came to check on you, Mercer said, when he'd recovered. Not to interfere. Just to... I know. The county has questions. People in town. I know about the people in town. They think you can't do this. Elias looked at the building frame, at Henry, walking along the top plate with the balance of someone who'd been doing it for years. At Boyd and Ray, moving lumber with their perpetual low-level argument, providing a kind of rhythm. What do you think? Elias asked. Mercer was quiet for a moment. I think, he said carefully, that I came out here expecting to find a mess, and I'm finding something else. It's still a mess, Elias said honestly. I burned breakfast this morning. Ray put a nail through his hand last week. Not badly, it's fine, but we're short on everything. I'm running on about 4 hours of sleep. But Elias thought about Calder at the table in the early morning with June's dress, about Nell sitting beside him at dinner, pressing her shoulder against his arm, about Pearl sleeping, actually sleeping, not managing, not watching for a full 8 hours, for the first time since they'd arrived, which Elias knew because he'd checked. But they're still here, Elias said. And so am I. Mercer nodded slowly. He looked at the building one more time, then mounted his horse. I'll hold the county off, he said. For now, I didn't ask you to. No, Mercer said, you didn't. He rode out, and Elias watched him go, and then turned back to the construction site, where Henry was calling down that they needed the next piece of lumber, and Boyd was telling Ray he was holding it wrong, and Ray was telling Boyd to mind his own, and Pearl had appeared at the cabin door to announce that dinner required someone's attention. Elias went to get the lumber. There was a particular evening, about 6 weeks in, that Elias would remember for a long time, not because anything dramatic happened, but because of what he noticed. He was sitting on the porch after dinner, in the last of the October light, and the children were distributed around him. Thomas had fallen asleep against the porch post, which he did sometimes without warning, simply folding like a puppet with its strings released. June and Dot were doing something with stones in the dirt, an intricate game with rules only they fully understood. Boyd and Ray were arguing about something at low volume, which was their normal mode of communication. Henry was in the barn. Pearl was inside. Calder was beside Elias, sitting on the step, not talking, just there. And Nell climbed up from the yard and positioned herself in Elias's lap, her back against his chest, and looked out at the same nothing he was looking at. And he put his arm around her, without thinking about it, and she made a small settling sound. She still didn't talk much. The doctor in town had said, wait, that grief in small children sometimes looked like silence. Elias wasn't waiting for her to talk. He'd learned her other languages, the way she pressed her hand to his arm when she wanted reassurance, the way she tilted her head to indicate she was listening, the way she looked at him directly when something mattered, and looked away when she was processing. She was looking directly at the evening sky. Elias looked with her. After a while, she said in a voice like something that had been stored up for a while, that one. He looked where she was pointing. A star, first one of the evening. Yeah, he said. She nodded once, satisfied, and settled back against him. Calder heard this exchange. He didn't say anything, but Elias saw the boy's jaw work once and look away. None of them in all this time had heard Nell choose to say something to someone. The season was turning. The house was going up. The money was still short, but less short than it had been, and Elias had a clear plan for the rest that didn't require miracles, just consistent work. And somewhere between the burned breakfasts and the borrowed wagon and the quiz about cattle names and the quiet on the porch and the star Nell had pointed at like it was something she'd been saving for him, Elias Crowe had stopped thinking of the ranch as the place where he lived and started thinking of it as home. He wasn't sure when exactly it had happened. He thought maybe it had been happening slowly, the way cold comes in, not suddenly, but by degrees, until one morning you wake up and it's already winter and you realize you've been living in it for a while without noticing. Inside the cabin, Pearl's voice carried through the wall. She was reading to June and Dot. Her voice was steady and clear and a little dramatic at the parts that required drama, and June's laugh came through the wall, a specific laugh, high and sudden, like a bell struck. Elias sat with Nell on his lap, and Calder beside him on the step, and the light went down, and the stir stayed where it was. The blizzard came on a Tuesday night, 3 weeks before the judge's review. Elias had seen it building all day in the northwest sky, that particular yellow-gray layering of cloud that old ranchers learned to read the way sailors read water, and he'd spent the afternoon making decisions about what could be done before it hit and what would have to wait until after. He'd gotten the cattle into the lower pasture where the windbreak was strongest. He'd brought in an extra week's worth of wood. He'd checked the roof of the addition twice, running his hands along the seams, pressing at the places where the sheeting met the framing, looking for gaps that cold could find. Found two. Fixed one before the light gave out. The second one he was still working on when the first edge of the storm reached the ranch, and the wind went from a push to a shove in the space of about 30 seconds. He came inside with ice in his beard and the smell of the coming cold so deep in his coat it wouldn't wash out until spring. The cabin was warm. That was the first thing, the specific warmth of a room with a good stove and too many bodies, which had stopped feeling strange to him sometime in November and now felt like the most normal thing in the world. Pearl had dinner going. June and Dot were at the table with their school books, which they used as props for the complicated marble game they'd invented, rather than for studying, a fact that Pearl was aware of and had decided not to fight tonight. Thomas was asleep in his corner, which meant he'd had a difficult day at school. He slept when he was overwhelmed, had always done this, and Elias had learned to read it as a signal rather than a behavior to correct. The twins were in the new addition, which was finished enough to sleep in, if you kept the connecting door open for the heat, and Henry was in the barn, which he'd made his preferred evening territory, regardless of weather, peering for dinner, and then returning to the animals with the loyalty of a man who found people manageable in doses. Calder was at the window. He'd been watching the sky all day, too. He turned when Elias came in. "How bad?" he said. "Bad," Elias said. "Stay inside tonight. All of you. The roof, I got most of it." He pulled his coat off and hung it. "One section on the northwest corner I didn't finish." Calder looked at the ceiling, calculating. "That's over the boys' room. I know. If the snow gets in, it might. We'll deal with it if it does." Calder turned back to the window. The wind was picking up by the minute now, a low continuous note that the cabin walls translated into vibration. Nell appeared from wherever she'd been. She moved around the cabin like water, turning up in unexpected places at unexpected times, and she pressed herself against Elias's leg without looking up at him. He put his hand on the top of her head. "It's loud," she said. "It's just wind," she considered this. "Big wind," she revised. "Big wind," he agreed. She stayed pressed against him while he got his boots off and hung his vest and ran through the mental list of what he'd done and hadn't done and couldn't do now. The cattle were in. The wood was in. The water barrel was full. The food supply was, he went through it, item by item, enough for a week if they were reasonable. The weak spot was the unfinished roof section. Everything else he'd managed. That one section was going to do what it was going to do. He'd been a rancher long enough to know the difference between problems he could solve and problems he could only respond to. This was the second kind. The storm hit fully sometime around 9 in the evening. The sound of it was different from ordinary wind, not just louder, but layered, multiple pitches working against each other, the kind of noise that got into the back of your skull and stayed there. Cabin held it well. The addition held less well. Elias could hear, through the connecting door, a whistle at the northwest corner that told him the gap he hadn't sealed was finding its voice. He and Calder looked at each other. "I'll go up," Elias said. "In this, it'll be worse by morning. It's already bad. I know the roof. I know where to step." He started putting his coat back on. "You'll need to hand things up to me. I can't carry materials and climb at the same time." Calder stood up without discussion and reached for his own coat. That was one of the things about him, he argued, when he thought something was wrong. But when the decision was made, he moved. He didn't perform reluctance. Pearl appeared in the doorway, between the rooms. "What are you doing?" she said, looking at the two of them in their coats. "Roof," Elias said, "in a blizzard. It's either now or we wake up with 6 inches of snow in the boys' room." Pearl looked at the ceiling. She did the same calculation Calder had done, and came to the same conclusion, and stepped back to let them pass. "I'll keep the stove up," she said. "Come back in when you need to warm your hands." Cold outside was a different category of cold, from what he'd worked in that afternoon. The wind had teeth in it, and the snow was moving nearly horizontal, which made seeing anything more than 10 feet away a question of luck. Elias had done this kind of work before, not with this many stakes riding on it, but the physical task was not unfamiliar. He knew his own roof. He'd built most of it himself. What he hadn't counted on was how much harder it was with someone else's life in his hands. Not Calder's specifically, all of them. The judge was 3 weeks away. The addition had to be livable. If the storm got into that room and warped the new plaster work and damaged the floor, which was green lumber, which would buckle, they would lose weeks of work, weeks they didn't have. He climbed. Calder was at the base of the ladder. Boards already organized the way Elias had shown him shortest to longest, accessible without moving, held flat against the wind, trying to catch them like sails. "Ready!" Calder called up. The wind swallowed the word, but Elias had been watching and he nodded. What followed was 2 hours of the most miserable work Elias could remember doing. The cold was inside his gloves inside of 20 minutes, which meant he was working with hands. He could feel less with every passing quarter hour, driving nails that he couldn't always feel land correctly and checking by sight instead of sensation. The roof surface was iced over in patches. He'd identified the safe routes before dark, had run his feet along them, so he'd know them by memory. But the wind kept catching him, and twice he grabbed the ridge with both hands and held on while the gust passed. Below him, Calder never complained. When Elias needed a board, Calder was already passing it up. When Elias called for the bucket of pitch that would seal the gap against the wet, it came up the ladder on the first call. The boy had been watching how Elias worked for weeks and had apparently filed all of it away somewhere useful. At some point, the wind shifted and the snow came straight down. For about 10 minutes, a brief reprieve, that Elias used to get the final board seated and nailed and sealed, pressing the pitch into the gap with his fingers, because a brush was useless up here, and he was past caring about his hands. He held the board in place and counted. He'd learned this from an old carpenter, years before count 60. After the last nail, the counting keeps your hands steady when you're too tired to hold them still any other way. He counted. The board held. He came down the ladder on pure will, because his hands had stopped being reliable, and his legs were doing their job, but only barely. Calder caught the last 3 rungs, just put himself there, hands on Elias's coat, steadying, without making anything of it. They went inside. The warmth of the cabin was so sudden it was almost painful. His hands started coming back somewhere around the stove, which was the painful part. The return of circulation in cold, deadened fingers was a specific kind of fire that he'd forgotten about. He held them over the heat and breathed through it. Pearl appeared with a cloth soaked in warm water and wrapped it around both his hands without asking. It was such an Emma thing to do, that particular practical tenderness, that for a moment he couldn't say anything. "Did it hold?" Pearl asked. He found his voice. "Should hold." Calder came and stood by the stove and didn't say anything, but he was watching Elias's face with an expression that was different from his usual measurement, something more open in it. They sat by the stove for a long time that night. The storm hammered at the walls and found nothing to get into, and eventually the children who had been awake drifted off one by one, Pearl on her bedroll, Calder in his corner with his blanket, Thomas still in his deep, exhausted sleep. Elias sat until the fire settled, and the wind did not, and then he sat some more, and eventually he slept in his chair. In the morning, the world outside was white and still, and 3 feet deeper than it had been. The boy's room was dry. He stood in the doorway and looked at the plaster ceiling, at the floor, at the windows, all of it intact, all of it dry, and he felt something release in his chest that he'd been holding since 9 o'clock the previous night. Boyd, waking up in his bedroll, looked up at him. "We okay?" he said. "We're okay," Elias said. Boyd went back to sleep. The roads into Blackwater Ridge were impassable for 4 days. This was, in some ways, simpler snow school, meant the children were home, which meant the work on the addition could continue, which was what needed to happen. In other ways, it was not simple at all, because 9 children confined to a finished enough but not house with nowhere to go, and a blizzard outside produced a friction that even the most patient adult found wearing. The twins had a fight on the second day that went beyond their normal low-level combat and into something real, a shoving match that ended with Ray's lip cut and Boyd refusing to speak. Elias separated them, and dealt with Ray's lip, and then dealt with Boyd's silence, which was the harder problem. Boyd, when he went quiet, went very quiet, and getting a word from him required the right approach, which Elias still didn't always know. He sat with Boyd in the barn Henry's territory, which Boyd had borrowed as neutral ground, and let the quiet sit for a while before he said anything. He said something, Elias said eventually. Not a question. Boyd's jaw moved. He said I was scared on the roof, that I'd have dropped something. Were you on the roof? No. That's the point. Elias thought about this. He was making something up to win an argument. He always does. You went after him for it, wouldn't you? Elias thought honestly. Probably, he said. But I'm 41 and I should know better. You're 10. What's your excuse going to be when you're 41? Boyd looked at him sideways. Something moved in the boy's expression. Did you have brothers? Boyd asked. One. Older. Did he make things up to win arguments? He made things up about everything. He was extremely creative with the truth. Boyd snorted. It was close to a laugh. What happened with him? Boyd asked. Elias was quiet for a moment. He died in the war, he said, before I'd figured out how to stop being mad at him. Boyd went still. I'm not saying make peace with Ray because life is short, Elias said. That's not the point I'm making. I'm saying the argument you're having today won't be the one you remember. The ones you remember are different. Which ones? The ones where someone actually needed something, and you didn't know it until it was over. Boyd looked at the barn floor, a long pause. Ray has bad dreams, he said quietly. He doesn't tell people. He acts fine, and then at night. He stopped. I'm the only one who knows. I wake up when he does. I know, Elias said. I've heard him. Boyd looked up. You have? I wake up when any of you do. Comes with the territory. Something crossed Boyd's face that was too complicated to name. He looked back at the floor. I'll go talk to him, Boyd said. All right. Not because you told me to. I know. Boyd got up and went, and Elias stayed in the barn for a while, with Henry's horses, and Henry's organized tack and the smell of hay and the muffled sound of wind outside that had dropped from last night's violence to a steady, manageable complaint. He was thinking about his brother. He thought about him less often than he thought about Emma, but on days like this one, the thought had teeth. Walter had been dead for 18 years, and Elias had never fully finished his accounting with him, the ledger of arguments and distances, and the things they should have said and didn't. You didn't get to finish that accounting when someone died fast. You just carried the open balance. He hoped Boyd and Ray were luckier than he and Walter had been. He thought they probably would be. They argued, like people who knew each other completely, which was a different kind of argument than the kind that grew from distance. The roads cleared on the 5th day, and life resumed its shape school, cattle, construction, dinner, the specific evening noise of 9 people in an enclosed space that Elias had stopped hearing as chaos and started hearing as texture. The judge's review was now 2 weeks away, and the addition needed 2 things still: the second stove and the interior doors. The stove he'd ordered in October from the merchant in town. It was supposed to have arrived already and hadn't, which was the merchant's problem becoming Elias's problem, and he rode into town on the first clear day to address this. Blackwater Ridge in December was a different place than Blackwater Ridge in October. The storefronts were shuttered against the cold, and the street traffic was sparse, and the particular quality of the light at this latitude in winter made everything look like a problem, half resolved. Elias tied his horse and went to Graeber's Mercantile, and had a conversation with Owen Graeber about the stove that started professionally and deteriorated as it became clear that the stove had not been ordered when Graeber had said ordered, and was now 4 weeks out. Minimum. Elias stood across the counter and looked at Graeber and felt the specific cold fury of a man who has managed everything within his control and is now being failed by something outside it. I need that stove before December 22nd, he said. His voice was level. Mr. Crowe, the supply situation from the east. I have a county judge reviewing my arrangement with 9 children on December 22nd. I need the house to be fully heated for that review. I communicated this when I placed the order. Graeber shifted. The supplier is not my problem, Elias said. You are my problem. You took my order and my deposit. I need you to find me a stove. A silence. Graeber had the expression of a man being asked to solve a problem he'd created. There might be a unit, Graeber said slowly, that came in last month for the Aldrich place. They didn't take delivery. Why not? Changed plans. He paused. It's a different size than what you ordered. Smaller. How much smaller? About 20%. Maybe 25. Elias thought about the boy's room. The space. The size of the connecting area. A smaller stove would run harder to heat the same space, which would mean more wood, which would mean more splitting, I'll take it, he said. And I want the price adjusted for the difference. He left Graeber's 20 minutes later with a delivery date of December 18th and an adjusted price that wasn't what he'd wanted, but was better than nothing, which was the available range of outcomes. He was untying his horse when he heard his name. The man who'd said it was standing at the edge of the boardwalk across the street, broad-shouldered, expensive coat for Blackwater Ridge, the bearing of someone who owned things and was accustomed to that ownership being recognized. Elias had seen him before in the way you saw everyone in a small town peripherally without occasion for introduction. Aldous Crane, the man said, crossing the street. I own the grain operation on the north end. I know who you are, Elias said. Then you know I have some standing in this county. He said it without apology, because men like this never apologized for stating facts. I understand you have a review coming up. The judge. That's not your business. It is, actually. Crane stopped a few feet away. Up close, he had the eyes of a man who calculated everything and considered the calculation sufficient, because I was the one who requested the review be held to a high standard. Elias looked at him. I filed a statement with the county clerk, Crane continued, expressing concern about the suitability of the arrangement. On what grounds? Single man. No formal training in child rearing. Incomplete housing, as of my last information. Financially. My finances are not your concern. When 9 county children are involved, the county makes everything its concern. He paused. Mr. Crowe, I'm not your enemy. I have a practical interest in this county's welfare. Those children could have proper placement, formal adoption arrangements with established families, families with resources, and the children have placement, Elias said. With me, an emergency placement that hasn't been made permanent. That's what the review is for. And I intend to present information at that review, Crane said. Information I think the judge should have. Elias looked at him for a long moment. He could see the shape of it now, the structure underneath the polite language. Crane wasn't concerned about the children. Crane was concerned about something else, something that the presence of 9 children on that particular piece of land near Miller Creek was inconveniencing, and the children were the lever he'd found to use. What do you want? Elias said. Crane looked briefly surprised, then rearranged into a more careful expression. I want what's best for... What do you actually want? Elias said. Because I've been alive long enough to know when someone's using a cause they don't care about for a purpose they do. A pause. Crane studied him. Your land, he said finally. The 300 acres past Miller Creek. I've been trying to acquire that corridor for 2 years. It completes my access to the North Range. Without it, my operations expansion is limited. My land isn't for sale. Everything's for sale at the right price. Not that, Mr. Crowe. I said no. The word fell between them, and neither man moved for a moment. Crane picked up his careful expression again, the one designed to look reasonable. I'll present my statement to the judge, he said. That's my right as a county resident. President, Elias said, and I'll present mine. He mounted his horse and rode back toward the ranch, and he didn't look back, and the cold of the December air felt different on the ride out than it had on the ride in sharper, purposeful, like something that needed to be gone through rather than avoided. He told Mercer that evening. Rode to the county office before he went home and laid out what Crane had said, exactly as it was said, without embellishment. Mercer listened with the expression of a man who was not surprised, but had hoped to be. Crane's had his eye on that corridor for a long time, Mercer said. What does he actually have on me? What can he actually say to the judge? Mercer was honest about it, which Elias appreciated. Incomplete housing, which is becoming less true by the day. Single status, no prior experience. Financial pressure. He paused. None of it is disqualifying on its own. Combined with the right judge and the wrong presentation, who's the judge? Hargrove. He's fair. He's not, Mercer chose his words. He's not the kind of man who warms to an arrangement because it's touching. He's the kind who wants facts, evidence, clear documentation. Then that's what we give him. You'll need more than just Mrs. Reyes. I know. The children themselves. No, Elias said immediately. Mercer looked at him. I won't put them in front of a judge and make them argue for themselves, Elias said. They've had to do enough of that. I'll argue for them. Mercer was quiet for a moment. Then Hargrove might ask to speak with Calder. He's 12. Old enough that the court may want his perspective. If Hargrove asks, that's different. But I won't use them. Mercer nodded slowly. All right. Elias rode home in the last of the fading December light and thought about Crane all the way back. And then he put Crane aside, because there was nothing more to do about Crane tonight. And there was dinner, and there was the ongoing reality of 9 people to feed and house and keep warm. Calder was on the porch when he rode in. You're late, Calder said. Not accusatory, just observational. Stopped at Mercer's. Something wrong? Elias dismounted. He looked at Calder, at 12-year-old Calder, with the old man posture and the careful eyes and the way he was always watching for the thing that was about to go wrong. He didn't want to tell him. He also didn't want to be the kind of adult who didn't tell him things, because Calder had spent his whole life around adults who made decisions about him in rooms he wasn't invited into. Man named Crane is going to present against us at the review, he said. He wants my land, and using the arrangement as leverage is his method. Calder took this in. Can he stop it? The adoption? He can try to. Will he succeed? Not if I have anything to say about it. Calder was quiet, looking out at the dark road. He doesn't know us, Calder said finally. His voice had something in it that wasn't quite anger, anger's quieter cousin. No, he's never been here. He doesn't know what it is. No, then we show him, Calder said the judge. We show him what it is. That's the plan. Calder nodded once and went inside, and Elias followed, and the warmth of the cabin and the smell of dinner and the noise of 8 other children hit him all at once, and for a moment he just stood in the doorway and let it. The second stove arrived on the 18th, as promised. It was smaller than what he'd ordered, and it ran hot if you weren't careful, but it heated the boy's room adequately, and it was there, which was what mattered. Henry helped him set it that same afternoon, the two of them working in the cold of the not quite finished room. Henry handing him pieces with his usual wordless precision. When it was done and they'd lit the first fire in it and stood watching to make sure it drew correctly, Henry said, "It'll be enough." "I think so," Elias said. "I mean all of it," Henry said. He wasn't looking at Elias. He was looking at the fire. "It'll be enough." For the judge. Elias looked at the boy. Henry was 8 years old, and he said perhaps 30 words a day. And every one of them was considered before it left his mouth, which meant this was not a throwaway comfort. "Think so?" Elias said. "I know what bad looks like," Henry said. "I've been in bad. This isn't it." He walked out of the room to go check on the horses, because that was Henry, and Elias stood alone in the new room, with the new stove burning small and steady, and outside the wind was doing its December business against the walls, and finding nothing that would give. 3 days before the review, Clara Reyes rode out again. She came in the afternoon, when the children were home from school, and she brought her grade book and her notes, and she sat across from Elias at the table and showed him what she had: academic progress, attendance record, behavioral observations, Pearl's advanced work, Calder's independent reading, Thomas's improvement in concentration, even a note about Nell's increasing vocabulary that Clara had been quietly documenting since October. "This is your evidence," she said. "All of this. 3 months of documented progress. Crane is going to talk about what I don't have," Elias said. "The experience." the formal training. And I'm going to talk about what they have, Clara said, which is better. He looked at her across the table. She had her hair pinned back the way she always did, practical and without vanity, and her expression had the quality it always had: direct, precise, not unkind. Why does this matter to you? He said. Really, she looked at him steadily. Because I was 12 years old when my father died and my mother couldn't manage. And I was sent to live with people who were adequate, she said. Adequate. Not bad. Not cruel. Just adequate. Like a room with enough heat to survive, but nothing more. She closed her gradebook. These children have more than adequate. I'm not going to let a man who wants your land take that from them. Outside, the children were doing what children do in the late afternoon, some kind of argument between the twins that was working itself toward resolution. Pearl's voice underneath it, doing the work of mediation. She couldn't stop doing even when Elias tried to free her from it. Thomas announcing something to no one in particular about tomorrow's weather. And Nell, sitting at the far end of the table with a piece of chalk and the small slate she'd claimed as her own, writing the letters that Pearl had been teaching her. She wrote them slowly, pressing too hard the way beginners do, her tongue between her teeth. She finished the row and looked up, and found both Elias and Clara watching her. She looked at her slate, looked back at them. Then she turned it around and held it up. She'd written Elias, not her name. His Clara made a sound that was not quite controlled. She looked away at the window and blinked, once, twice. Elias looked at Nell, at his name in crooked chalk letters, on a small slate in the hands of a 4-year-old who had not spoken for 3 weeks after he'd first picked her up out of the mud. That's right, he said. His voice was steady. He made sure of it. That's exactly right. Nell nodded, satisfied, and turned the slate back around and started on the next row. Clara looked back at the table. She picked up her grade book. December 22nd, she said. Her voice was even again, too. I'll be there. The morning of December 22nd arrived with the kind of cold that made everything brittle, the air, the ground, the inside of your lungs when you breathed too fast. Elias was up before 4, which was not unusual, but the quality of his wakefulness was different from the ordinary pre-dawn kind. He lay on his bedroll for about 3 minutes, staring at the ceiling, and then got up because lying there wasn't doing anything useful. He built the fire up in both stoves, the main cabin and the boys' room, and then went out to the cattle before the light came, because the cattle didn't care about county reviews, and the morning chores had to happen regardless of what else the day contained. He worked in the dark by feel and by the small sounds the animals made, and the cold was sharp enough that his breath came out in clouds, and his hands were stiff inside the gloves before he'd been outside 10 minutes. When he came back in, Calder was up. This was not surprising. Calder had been waking early for weeks earlier than usual, which was saying something with the particular insomnia of someone who has a specific thing to worry about and worries about it in the dark. He was sitting at the table with his hands around a cup of water because the coffee wasn't made yet, and he looked up when Elias came in. "How's it outside?" he said. "Cold, clear. Roads will be passable." Calder nodded. He looked at the table. "What time do we leave?" "Reviews at 10. We should be there by 9:30. Elias hung his coat and went to the stove. "You don't have to come." "I want to come," Mercer said. "The judge might want to talk to you." "I want you to be prepared for that." "I am prepared." Elias looked at him. "What are you going to say?" Calder thought for a moment. Not with the stalling quality of someone who doesn't know, with the considered quality of someone who has been rehearsing and is selecting which version to give. "The truth," he said finally. "What it was like before. What it's like now, the difference. Keep it simple." "Hargrove is a fax man, I know," Mercer told me. Elias hadn't known. Mercer had spoken to Calder directly. He looked at the boy. "When did Mercer tell you that?" "He came out 2 days ago while you were in the south pasture." Calder met his eyes, not apologetic. He said you wouldn't like it. He said he was doing it anyway, because it was the right thing. Elias absorbed this. He wasn't sure how he felt about Mercer going around him. He also wasn't sure Mercer was wrong. What else did he say? That Crane is going to talk about what the house looked like in October. He has statements from 2 people who rode past in early November when the framing was still open. Calder paused. He also said Crane has a lawyer. I know. Do we have a lawyer? We have Clara. Calder looked at him steadily. Clara isn't a lawyer. No, but she's better than one for this purpose. Calder thought about this and apparently concluded it was either correct or not something he could do anything about, because he nodded and went back to looking at the table. Pearl woke the others at 6, which she'd been asked to do, and which she executed with the efficiency of someone who had done it many times, moving through the rooms with the lamp, a word for each of them, letting the younger ones come to wakefulness at their own pace, while keeping the whole process from running long. By 7, everyone was fed and dressed, which was a logistical achievement that Elias had stopped taking for granted sometime in November. He'd told most of them to stay home. The review didn't require their presence, and the schoolhouse would be open, and it was a better use of the day. Pearls accepted this without argument, which told him she was frightened and covering it. Henry accepted it because he accepted most things that involved fewer people in a room. The twins were disappointed and showed it, but Boyd's disappointment had a maturity to it, and Sweat had the quality of energy looking for somewhere to go, and Elias redirected both by leaving them a list of afternoon tasks that were real and necessary and would take until dark. Thomas and the younger girls went to school. Nell stayed home with Pearl. At 9, Elias and Calder hitched the wagon and drove to Blackwater Ridge. They didn't talk much on the road. The cold made prolonged conversation. Impractical breath came out in clouds and disappeared, and somehow speech felt wasteful in that temperature, better saved for when it counted. Elias drove, and Calder sat beside him, with his hands in his pockets, and the collar of his coat up, and his eyes on the road ahead, with an expression that was working very hard at composure. About a mile from town, Calder said, if it goes wrong. It's not going to go wrong, but if it does. He stopped. If it does, I need to know what happens next. Elias kept his eyes on the road. If Hargrove rules against the permanent placement, he said, carefully, there's an appeal process. Mercer already looked into it. It takes time, but it's available. And while the appeal is happening, I don't know, Elias said, because he didn't. Because that was the honest answer, and Calder deserved honest answers. Silence. I'm not going to let them separate us, Calder said. His voice was very quiet and very flat, which was how he sounded when he was saying something he meant completely. I know. I mean, I will do something about it if it comes to that. Calder, I will. Elias looked at him then, fully long enough that he had to trust the horse to hold the road. Calder was staring straight ahead. 12 years old with the jaw set at that angle that had been working at controlled since the courthouse steps 3 months ago. Listen to me, Elias said. Calder looked at him. I will do everything within my legal power, and then some things adjacent to it, before I let that happen, Elias said. You have my word on that. What I need from you today is to trust me enough to let me fight this the right way. Can you do that? A long pause. Yes, Calder said. All right. They drove the last mile into town. The county courthouse in Blackwater Ridge was the largest building in town by a significant margin, which was less a testament to its grandeur than a testament to the town's modesty. It was 2 stories of limestone block with a wooden upper story that someone had added in a later decade, and that didn't quite match the lower half. The courtroom was on the ground floor, warm enough from the big iron stove in the corner that the air felt slightly thick after the outside cold. Clara was already there when they arrived, sitting straight-backed in the second row with her grade book and a folder of papers on her lap. She looked at Elias when he came in and gave him the slight nod that meant she was ready, which he returned. Mercer was near the front. He came over when he saw them. Crane's here, he said quietly. He brought a man named Pickett. He's not exactly a lawyer, more of a county petition specialist, but he knows procedure, and he's good at making things sound worse than they are. What does the judge know coming in? Elias said. The file, the emergency placement authorization, the review trigger, Crane's written statement, which I've seen. It focuses on the housing situation in November and your financial records, which Crane apparently obtained Through the county land office, legally. I checked. There's no remedy there. What's in my financial records? The withdrawal amounts, the rate at which you've been spending. Without context, it looks like a man in financial difficulty. Elias looked at the front of the courtroom. And with context, it looks like a man building a house for 9 children. Mercer paused. That's what we give Hargrove. Context. The judge came in at 10 past 10, which was 10 minutes late, without apology or explanation, which was apparently simply how Judge Hargrove operated. He was a compact man in his late 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the particular stillness of someone who spent a lot of time listening and had gotten good at it. He sat, arranged his papers, and looked around the room with eyes that didn't give anything away. Aldous Crane was seated across the aisle with his petition man, Pickett, a narrow-shouldered man with a precise part in his hair who looked like someone who filed things for a living and found the work satisfying. Crane himself was in his expensive coat, his posture, the posture of a man who expected to be listened to and was accustomed to being right about that. He looked at Elias once across the aisle with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally dismissive. Elias looked back at him without anything particular in his expression and then looked at the judge. Hargrove opened the review methodically. He stated the case number, the nature of the emergency placement, the basis for the review, and the standard he would be applying, the welfare and stability standard, which he explained in plain language. Were the children better off in this arrangement than they would be in alternatives? And was the arrangement sustainable going forward? He said this without warmth and without coldness, just precision, and Elias found he respected it. Pickett went first at Hargrove's direction. He had a folder and he used it, presenting the points in sequence with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times. The housing situation as of November, documented by statements from 2 witnesses who had observed the unfinished construction. The financial withdrawals presented as numbers without the story behind them. The lack of formal training or certification. The absence of a co-parent or family support structure. The flagged previous placements of 2 of the children, meaning Boyd and Ray, which Pickett presented as evidence of behavioral difficulty rather than evidence of children who had been trying to stay together. He was good at it, Elias admitted to himself. He didn't lie. He took accurate facts and arranged them in a sequence that created an inaccurate picture. It was a specific skill. When Pickett finished, Hargrove looked at Elias. Mr. Crowe, you're representing yourself? Yes, sir. You understand you're entitled to have someone present with you. I have Mrs. Clara Reyes, sir, schoolteacher at the Blackwater Ridge Schoolhouse. She has documentation regarding the children's progress and can speak to their condition. Hargrove looked at Clara. Mrs. Reyes, you're here as a character witness? As a direct observer, Your Honor, Clara said, standing. I have daily contact with 7 of the 9 children. I've been documenting their academic progress, attendance, and welfare since they entered my school in October. I have those records here. Hargrove held out his hand. Clara brought the folder forward, and he opened it and spent a full 2 minutes reading, which was a long time in a courtroom. His expression didn't change. He turned pages. He went back to 1 page and looked at it again. This is Mrs. Pearl, age 9. She completed work at this level? He indicated something on the page. Correct, Your Honor. In November. I've since been providing her with additional material. Hargrove looked at the page for another moment, then closed the folder and set it aside. Mr. Crowe addressed the financial picture that Mr. Pickett presented. Elias stood. He'd thought about how to do this. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't a talker. He was a man who said what was true and hoped it was enough. Draws Mr. Pickett showed you are the cost of building the addition, he said. 3 rooms, 2 stoves, materials and supplies for 10 people through a Kansas winter. If you compare the rate of withdrawal to the rate of construction progress, he handed his own folder to Mercer, who brought it forward. You'll see that every dollar is accounted for, and most of it is now standing as finished housing on my property. Hargrove took the folder. He looked at the building documentation. Elias sketched the addition dimensions, listed materials, dated each phase of completion. The house was unfinished in November, Hargrove said. Yes, sir. I started building it in October, 6 weeks after I took the children home. I finished the sleeping rooms first. The roof was completed and sealed before the first hard freeze. He paused. The witnesses Mr. Pickett cited saw the framing phase. The house has been fully enclosed and heated since December 5th. Hargrove made a note. Mr. Pickett raised the issue of prior placement flags for 2 of the children. Hargrove said, Boyd and Raymond. Would you like to address us that? Elias thought about Boyd in the barn, telling him about Ray's nightmares. About Ray, who talked too much and meant most of it, driving lumber with a competition ferocity that got more done than any amount of instruction. Those flags were generated when the county tried to separate the children from each other. He says, Boyd and Ray ran from placements because they were trying to get back to their family. That's not a behavioral problem. That's loyalty. A short silence in the room. Hargrove looked at him with those still careful eyes. Are you suggesting the county's placement decisions contributed to the behavioral issues it then used to justify further separation? Yes, sir, that's what I'm suggesting. From across the aisle, Pickett made a sound. Hargrove looked at him once, and the sound stopped. I'd like to hear from Mrs. Reyes regarding the children's current stability, Hargrove said. Clara stood and spoke for 12 minutes, Elias counted. She was precise and specific, not about feelings, not about impressions, but about documented observable facts. Attendance rates. Academic progress measured against county standards. Behavioral incidents, which were few and minor. Specific observations about each child's development, named and detailed. She talked about Pearl's mathematics, about Thomas's improvement in concentration, about Henry's quietly extraordinary aptitude with animals and mechanical systems, about Nell's speech development, which she described clinically, but which had Mercer, beside Elias, going very still. She did not make it sentimental. Sentiment was not what Hargrove wanted, and Clara understood that. She made it factual, and the facts were, on their own, sufficient. When she finished, Hargrove looked at Crane. Mr. Crane, you filed a written statement. Is there anything you wish to add in person? Crane stood. He was composed, measured, clearly a man who had done this kind of thing before. Your Honor, my concern is simple. This county has an obligation to ensure the welfare of these children is secured by a stable and sustainable arrangement. What Mr. Crowe has done for 3 months is admirable. He paused on the word admirable in a way that made it sound like the opposite. But admirable is not the same as permanent. A single man, with no family support, managing 9 children on a working ranch, will face compounding difficulties as the children age. The county should consider whether a more formally structured arrangement. Mr. Crane, Hargrove said, do you have a specific alternative arrangement to propose? A pause. Not at this time, Your Honor. I simply want the court to weigh. I understand what you want the court to weigh. Hargrove looked back at his papers. Is there anything else? Crane sat down. Hargrove was quiet for a moment, looking at the documents in front of him. Elias sat very still. Beside him, Calder was very still. The room was the kind of quiet that a room gets when everyone in it is waiting for something. I'm going to ask the boy to come forward, Hargrove said. Calder. Is he present? Calder stood before Elias could say anything. Yes, sir, he said. Come up here, please. Calder walked to the front of the room. He stood in front of the judge's table with his hands at his sides and his chin level, and his face doing the work it had been doing since the courthouse steps in September. That careful, controlled steadiness that 12 years of needing to be steady had built into him. Hargrove looked at him directly. I'm not going to ask you to say anything that reflects on Mr. Crowe positively or negatively, Hargrove said. I just want to ask you one question, and I want you to answer it honestly. Do you understand? Yes, sir. What is different about your life now compared to before September? Calder was quiet for a moment. Elias watched him. Watched the boy who had been managing 8 other children with no tools and no help and no guarantee. who had stood on courthouse steps in the rain and argued with a county official because he didn't have anything else left to argue with, who sat at a table in the early morning and sewed up a torn dress because someone had to. Before, Calder said, I had to watch all the time. Every placement, every arrangement I had to watch for when it was going to go wrong so I could get them out before it did. I had to watch the adults and figure out what they wanted and whether what they wanted was going to hurt us. He paused. Still watch. I probably always will. But now when I watch, I'm not looking for the exit. I'm just watching. Because I want to know what's happening. Not because I need to know which way to run. The room was completely quiet. Hargrove looked at him for a long moment. Thank you, he said. You can sit down. Calder walked back and sat beside Elias. And he sat with perfect composure, and Elias put his hand on the boy's shoulder once, briefly, and Calder let him. Hargrove took 15 minutes. He went to his chambers, and the courtroom sat in its awkward, waiting silence. Crane and Pickett conferring quietly at their side. Mercer beside Elias, going through papers. He wasn't really reading. Clara straight-backed in her row. Calder sat without moving and stared at the front of the room. When Hargrove came back, he sat, arranged his papers, and read his ruling in the same precise, uninflected tone he'd used for everything else. He found the housing situation adequate and improving. He found the financial picture consistent with the documented expenditures on construction and maintenance. He found the children's welfare, as documented by Mrs. Reyes, and consistent with the county education records, to be markedly improved from their condition at the time of emergency placement. He found no basis for the concerns raised in Mr. Crane's statement to constitute grounds for disruption of the current arrangement. He approved the extension of placement pending formal adoption proceedings to be initiated within 60 days. He looked up from the papers when he was done. Mr. Crowe, he said, sir, finish the paperwork within 60 days. A pause. Something shifted in Hargrove's expression. Not warmth, exactly, but the particular acknowledgement of a man who has seen a lot and has learned to recognize something genuine when it comes before him. Don't make me come back out here. No, sir, Elias said. Hargrove gathered his papers and left. Crane left without speaking to Elias, which was a choice, and Pickett followed him out with the file folder under his arm. Mercer exhaled loudly enough that it was almost a word. Clara sat back in her chair and closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds, and then opened them and was composed again. Calder stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the street, and Elias could see his profile, the jaw still set, the eyes moving over the cold December street outside. Then something released in his face, not dramatically, just something let go, quietly, the way a knot loosens when you stop pulling against it. He turned around. 60 days, he said. 60 days, Elias confirmed. That's, Calder did the arithmetic. February. Middle of February. Calder nodded. He looked at the floor. Then Pearl's going to want to know exactly. Tell her February 15th, Mercer said behind them. I'll have the paperwork ready by then. I'll make sure of it. Calder looked at Mercer. Something passed across his face, not gratitude, which was too large and too practiced a word for what was actually there. More like recognition, the specific acknowledgement of someone who has received something real from an unexpected direction. Thank you, he said, to Mercer. Mercer cleared his throat. Doing my job, he said. You did more than that. Mercer looked at his papers. The ride home was warmer than the ride in, despite the temperature being the same. It was one of those things that didn't make physical sense and made complete human sense. Calder sat beside Elias on the wagon seat, and the cold was still there, and the road was still frozen, but neither of those things had the same quality they'd had this morning. Halfway back, Calder said, he was never going to win. Crane? He never knew us. He just knew what was on paper. Elias thought about this. That's how people lose arrangements like this, he said, when all anyone sees is what's on paper. Hargrove came out and looked. Calder said, yes. He came out and looked at us. He talked to you, Elias said. That's what decided it. Calder was quiet for a moment. Is that why you let me come? Knowing he might call me? Partly. You could have prepared me better. If I'd prepared you more, it would have sounded prepared. He kept his eyes on the road. What you said in there sounded like the truth, because it was the truth. You didn't need me to prepare that. Calder was quiet for a long time. My mother used to say something, he said finally. He didn't talk about his family. Elias had learned not to ask, to wait for the moments when Calder chose to. She said, the only thing worth having is something true. Everything else rots. She sounds like she was right, Elias said. She was. About most things. He paused. She was wrong about some things, too. She wasn't perfect. Nobody is, I know. Calder looked at the road ahead. I used to think she was. When you're little, you think that most people do. When did you stop? Elias thought about his own father, a man of practical virtues and significant silences, who had taught him to work and failed to teach him much else, and had been doing his best with what he had, which Elias had not understood until he was doing the same thing himself in his own inadequate way. About 40, he said. Took me a while. Calder almost smiled. Not quite. Close enough. When they came up the wagon road and the ranch came into view, there was smoke coming from both chimneys and a lantern lit in the window. Pearl, keeping things going the way she always did, and through the glass, Elias could see movement, the warm interior noise of the place operating without him, which he had been worried it might not, and which it clearly did. He pulled the wagon to a stop, and they climbed down, and before they'd reached the porch, the door opened. Pearl stood in the doorway. She read their faces in the way Pearl always read faces fast, comprehensive, looking for the thing underneath the surface expression. What she found made her close her eyes for a moment. Then she stepped back and held the door open. "Come in," she said. "It's cold." Inside, the stove was banked high, and the table was set for dinner, and June and Dot were in their corner with their marble game, and Thomas was asleep against the wall. And through the door to the addition, Elias could hear the twins doing something that produced a rhythmic sound he chose not to investigate immediately. Henry appeared from the barn door, looked at them both, and read the same thing Pearl had read and nodded once, and went back inside. Nell was at the table with her slate. She looked up when Elias came in. She'd been writing something. She held the slate up when she saw his face, whatever she saw in it giving her information she wanted to respond to. The slate said, in the careful overlarge letters of someone learning, "Home." He looked at the word, at her face, at the warm interior of the cabin that had been one room and a man's solitude, and was now this noise and heat and imperfect, complicated living thing. "Yeah," he said. "Home." Nell put the slate down and went back to writing, and Pearl started moving around the kitchen with the focused purpose of someone who had been holding herself in check and could now let the tension out through work. And Calder sat down at the table and said, to no one in particular, February 15th, which was met with Pearl setting down a pot hard enough to make a sound that wasn't quite a response and wasn't quite not one. Elias hung his coat. He sat down at the table in his chair, the one that had become his chair, because 9 people had arranged themselves around it and left it consistently in one place, which was how ownership accrued, without anyone deciding it, and he looked at the room. The adoption paperwork would come in February. He had 60 days of continued work ahead of him, and the work would be the same as it had always been: cattle, construction, where there was still construction to do, food and heat, and the ongoing education of both himself and 9 children in how to be a family that worked. It would not become easier because the judge had ruled well. It would become different, differently complicated, differently demanding, differently rewarding. He knew that. He'd known it from the day he signed his name in the courthouse. What he hadn't known, what he'd had no way of knowing, standing in the rain with a 4-year-old on his shoulder and a county officer telling him it wasn't practical, was that the complications would stop feeling like burdens somewhere around the middle of November, that they would start feeling like the texture of a life that had substance again, which was a thing he hadn't had for 9 years, and hadn't known how badly he'd been missing until it came back, all at once, in the form of 9 people who needed him to be functional and present and honest about his failures, which turned out to be the same things he needed himself. Stove ticked. Nell wrote letters on her slate. Indian season. Pearl made sounds in the kitchen that were the sounds of someone doing a thing they were good at. Through the wall, one of the twins said something to the other, and got a response that led to a brief, pointed exchange that resolved itself into silence, which meant they'd either agreed or given up, and either outcome was acceptable. February 15th, Elias thought. 60 days. He'd built a house in worse time than that. The 60 days did not pass cleanly. Nothing in Elias Crowe's life had ever passed cleanly, and he'd stopped expecting it to sometime in his 30s, so the complications of January and early February arrived not as surprises but as the ordinary resistance of a world that didn't organize itself around human schedules. The cattle lost 3 more head to a second cold snap in mid-January, not the blizzard kind, but the sustained kind, the week-long freeze that got into animals' lungs and didn't let go. He found them on a Thursday morning in the far pasture, and he stood looking at them for a while in the gray January, light doing the arithmetic of what that meant for spring. And then he went back to the barn and told Henry, because Henry would want to know and would process it better than most adults Elias had known. Henry listened and then said, "The Aldersons lost 5 last week." "I know. We're still ahead of most. That's one way to look at it." Henry looked at him with those steady 8-year-old eyes. "Is there a better way?" Elias thought about it honestly. "Not this morning," he said. "Maybe tomorrow." Henry nodded and went back to his work, which was one of the things about Henry he didn't require the adults around him to perform optimism. He took the real version and filed it away, and moved on, which was a quality Elias had spent 40 years trying to develop, and this child had arrived with it fully formed. The money tightened again in January, the way it always tightened in the month after Christmas feed costs, wood costs, the ongoing expense of 10 people existing in winter. Elias sold the 2 steers he'd been holding back, getting a price that was adequate and not more than adequate, and the transaction put him in a position that was not comfortable but was sustainable, which was the best he could do with what January had to offer. Pearl knew, because Pearl always knew. She'd been watching his ledger since October and had developed an understanding of the ranch's financial situation that was frankly more nuanced than most adults Elias had dealt with in business. She came to him one evening in the second week of January and said, without preamble, "We should reduce the flour order this month and make up the difference with cornmeal. Cornmeal is cheaper. I know Thomas complains. I'll handle Thomas. Thomas complaining is the least of the difference is 40 cents, Pearl said, over the month. That's 40 cents toward the filing fee for the adoption papers. He looked at her across the table. She was 9 years old, and she was managing a household budget with the focus of someone who understood that the margin between enough and not enough was precisely the width of a decision made or not made. "The filing fee is covered," he said. "The filing fee plus the lawyer Mercer said we might need for the documentation." "We're not getting a lawyer," Mercer said. "Mercer worries more than necessary. But Clara's helping with the documentation." Pearl considered this. She was not fully satisfied, which was how Pearl operated. She held concerns until they were resolved by facts rather than reassurance. But she nodded and let it go for now, which was the concession she made when she'd said her piece and decided to trust him to handle the rest. Clara had, in fact, been helping with the documentation since December 23rd, the morning after the hearing, when she'd appeared at the ranch with a systematic approach to the adoption paperwork that suggested she'd been thinking about it before Hargrove's ruling made it necessary. She had a template from a previous arrangement in the county, she said. She'd worked through the requirements. She knew which forms needed which supporting documentation and in what order. She came twice a week through January, always in the afternoon after school, staying for dinner with the increasing inevitability of someone who had stopped being a visitor and become something more regular. She and Pearl worked at the table on the documentation, while Elias managed the evening cattle, and the children moved around them the way people move around, a thing that has become part of the furniture, without particular ceremony, without making much of it. Calder made much of it internally, which Elias was aware of. Calder noticed everything and processed it privately, and what he'd noticed since October was the pattern of Clara's presence, the way Elias talked to her differently from how he talked to Mercer, or to Harlan, Briggs, or to any other adult. The way the cabin had a particular quality in the evenings when she was there versus the evenings when she wasn't. He didn't say anything about it for weeks. That was characteristic. Then one evening in late January, he said, helping Elias with the harness repair that had been waiting since November. "You like her." Elias didn't pretend not to understand. "She's a good woman." That's not what I said. A pause. The barn was cold, but workably cold, the kind that kept you awake without making you miserable, and outside the wind was doing its January thing against the walls. "Yes," Elias said. "I like her." "Does she know that?" "I have no idea." Calder was quiet for a moment, working the leather. "Stays late," he said, "and she doesn't have to." "I know. And she brought Pearl those advanced arithmetic books from her own house. Pearl said they were hers from when she was studying." "I know. People don't give away their own books unless—" Calder stopped, thought about how to finish the sentence. "Unless they're planning to have access to them again." Elias looked at him sideways. Calder looked back with the expression of a 12-year-old who had processed something and arrived at a conclusion and was presenting it without editorial because he'd decided it was his business to present it. "I'm not saying do anything about it," Calder said. "I'm just saying what I see." He went back to the leather, and Elias went back to the harness, and neither of them said anything else about it. But Elias thought about it. He thought about it more than he'd let himself think about anything personal in a long time. It was a specific kind of thinking, the careful, reluctant kind that a man does when he's approaching something he wants and is afraid of wanting. Because the last time he wanted something like this, it ended in a way that nearly broke him. Emma had been dead for 9 years. He had not stopped loving her. He'd learned, over time, that love didn't operate like a finite resource, that it didn't run out or transfer or get replaced. What had happened instead was more complicated. The grief had become something he carried rather than something that carried him. And in the carrying of it, over years, space had opened. Not empty space, just room. Room that hadn't been there before. He didn't do anything about it through the rest of January. Then February came, and the paperwork was nearly complete. And on a Wednesday evening, Clara stayed later than usual. After the children had gone to bed, finishing the last of the documentation at the table while Elias sat across from her with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. She finished the last form, stacked the papers, and sat back. "That's everything Mercer needs," she said. "Thank you," he said. It was inadequate. He was aware of how inadequate it was. She looked at him. In the lamplight, her face had the quality it got when she'd stopped performing composure and was simply being the difference between Clara Reyes as she was in public and Clara Reyes at the end of a long day in a warm room. "You don't have to thank me," she said. "I know I don't have to." A pause. The stove made its small sounds. Outside, very faintly, one of the boys shifted in his sleep, the particular sound that Elias had learned to distinguish from real wakefulness, the kind that needed attention. "I lost my husband 4 years ago," Clara said. Not as a segue, just said. The way she said hard things, directly, without approach. He was a good man, quiet. He taught himself to read at 32 and was proud of it in a way he tried to hide. She looked at the table. "I was adequate at being a wife. I don't think I was exceptional at it. I was better at the school." Elias looked at her. "I'm telling you this," she said, "because I think you should know who I actually am before." She stopped, chose the next words carefully. "Before whatever this is." "Whatever this is," he repeated. She looked at him directly. "I'm not a simple woman. I have opinions about everything, and most of them are correct, which I know is not an easy thing to be around. I will always care more about Pearl's education than about whether dinner is on time. I don't manage grief by talking about it. I manage it by working, which means sometimes I'm not present in the way people need. I manage mine by working too," he said. "I know." She paused. "I've watched you for 4 months." "I know." a silence that had a particular quality to it, not empty, but full of the thing that was being decided without being stated. "I'm not easy," she said again. "I have 9 children," he said. "I don't need easy. I need real." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "All right." That was the whole conversation. It was enough. The adoption papers were filed with the county clerk on February 12th, 3 days before Mercer's deadline, because Elias had learned the hard way not to rely on the last day for anything that mattered. Mercer received them and confirmed receipt, and said the review would take a week, standard processing, and that he expected no complications. There were no complications. The order came through on February 21st, a Thursday, in an envelope that Mercer brought out to the ranch personally rather than sending through the mail, which was a choice that said something about Mercer that Elias had long suspected and now confirmed. He arrived in the afternoon when school was done and the children were home. He came to the door and Elias opened it, and Mercer held out the envelope. "That's it," Mercer said. Elias took it. He looked at it for a moment, a Brown County envelope with his name on the front in the clerk's careful hand. He became aware that the room had gone quiet behind him. The particular quality of quiet that meant people were paying attention without wanting to be caught at it. He opened the envelope. The document inside was 2 pages. He read the first page, the legal language, the case number, the statutory basis, the county seal. Then the second page, which was the one that mattered. The list, 9 names, each one beside his own. Calder James Crowe, Pearl Ann Crowe, Henry Crowe, Boyd Crowe, Ray Crowe, Thomas Crowe, Dorothy Crowe, June Crowe, Nell Crowe. He stood looking at the list until the paper came slightly out of focus, which was a thing that happened when a man had been awake since before 4 in the morning for the past several months, and was possibly, this particular moment, not entirely composed. He turned around. The room had 8 children in it. Thomas was looking at him with his whole face, which was how Thomas looked at everything. Pearl was standing very still in a way that meant she was working hard at stillness. Henry was in the doorway to the addition, arms at his sides. The twins were stopped in whatever they'd been doing. Boyd was something in his hand that he'd forgotten to put down. June and Dot were at the table, holding hands under it the way they always did in uncertain moments. Calder was at the back, standing apart, which was where he always positioned himself when he didn't know yet what the moment was going to require. Nell was at Elias's feet. She'd come to stand there sometime in the last minute, as quietly as she did everything, and she was looking up at him with those serious dark eyes. He crouched down. He held the paper where she could see it, and he pointed to her name, Nell Crowe, and he said, That's you." She looked at the name. She read her own name. She'd been reading it for weeks, had been reading everyone's names. It was one of her projects, and she looked back at him. Then she took his face in both her small hands. The gesture was so direct, so entirely without preamble that it stopped him completely. She held his face and looked at him with the full seriousness of a child who has decided something and is making sure it lands. "Ours," she said. "You're ours." He put his arms around her and held on. He heard Pearl make a sound from across the room, a single, brief, inadequately controlled sound. And then Pearl was moving, and the twins were moving. And Thomas crossed the room at a near run and hit Elias's side with both arms. And June and Dot came together from the table, and Henry, from his doorway, walked slowly across the room and stood close, without quite joining the collision, which was perfect Henry. Calder came last. He walked from the back of the room, and he stopped in front of Elias, who was still crouched with Nell in one arm, and Thomas attached to his other side, and Pearl's hand on his shoulder, and the rest of them around him in various states of contact. Calder stood and looked at him with an expression that had finally let go of the careful guarding that had been in it every day since September. He didn't say anything for a moment. He didn't need to. "Then we should tell Mercer he can go home." Elias laughed, came out ragged, which was honest. "Yeah," he said, "we should." Behind them, Mercer, who had been standing in the doorway the whole time and had apparently been watching, and had apparently not managed to be entirely professional about it, cleared his throat and said he'd see himself out, and was gone before anyone had to look at his face. The celebration that evening was the kind that happens when people are too overwhelmed for anything theatrical, a better dinner than usual, because Pearl had been holding back a cut of salt pork for the occasion since she'd known the papers were coming, the twins managing to be in the same room without a single argument, which was either a tribute to the occasion or a statistical anomaly. Thomas falling asleep at the table in the middle of a sentence, which was so ordinary that it was itself a kind of comfort. Clara came at 6 because she'd known the papers were expected this week and had planned accordingly, and she brought the pie that Pearl had asked her to bring without telling Elias. And the pie was apple, and it was good. And Elias ate 2 pieces because he was a man who was, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely hungry. He sat at the long table, the new table, the one he'd built in November to replace the 2-person original, long enough for 11 if someone didn't mind the end, and he looked at the people around it and felt the specific weight of a moment that is happening exactly the way it was always supposed to happen, which is not a feeling most people get to have, and which, in his experience, never announced itself until it was already half over. He thought about Emma. He did this sometimes at significant moments, not with the old, sharp grief, but with the settled acknowledgement of a man who has learned to carry a loss without it being the only thing he carries. She had wanted a house that sounded like people. She had talked about it specifically, practically, as a future she was building toward. He was sitting inside it. He didn't know what to do with that, except to be here, fully, and not look away from it. Clara, across the table, caught his eye. She had the quiet look she got when she knew he was somewhere inside his own head, not pulling him back, just marking the fact that she saw it and he could take his time. That was one of the things about her. She didn't need him to be present every second. She just needed him to come back. He came back. The months that followed the adoption had the quality of things that are hard and getting easier, which is the only honest way to describe any life that is working correctly. The ranch continued to require what a ranch always requires: more work than the hours contain, more money than the revenue reliably provides, more patience than any person naturally possesses. 300 acres is not a forgiving quantity of land. Kansas winters are not forgiving seasons. 9 children are not forgiving company, in the sense that they are constant and demanding and fully present in a way that doesn't allow for much half attention. But somewhere in the spring, the real spring, the April kind, when the ground finally unfroze and the light came back with its particular quality of permission, things shifted in a way that was hard to point to exactly but impossible to miss. The ranch started to feel like something that was building rather than something that was holding. Calder at 13 was a genuine ranch hand, not a child playing at it, but someone who could be trusted with real decisions about the cattle, and who made those decisions with a seriousness that occasionally made Elias feel as though the roles had gotten turned around, which they had, somewhat, which was not a bad thing. Pearl's mathematics had exceeded what Clara could teach her, which Clara announced one April afternoon, with the specific combination of pride and practical problem-solving orientation that was pure Clara. She'd identified a retired schoolmaster in the next county who could continue Pearl's instruction by correspondence. She'd written to him already, and Pearl needed to write a letter introducing herself, which Clara was now requesting Elias to encourage her to do. "You could have asked me first," Elias said. "Was going to," Clara said. "And then I thought about how long going to takes and wrote the letter." He looked at her. She looked back without apology. "You're not easy," he said. "I told you that in February." "You did," he said. "I remember." The conversation about what Clara was going to be, officially, formally, in the way the county would record it, happened in May, at the table, in the evening, after the children were in bed. It was not a dramatic conversation. It was practical and honest, and had the quality of 2 people who had been deciding something gradually, and were now acknowledging that the decision was already made. "The children have started calling you Clara," Elias said. "I know, all of them except Nell." "What does Nell call me?" "She calls you the lady." he said, affectionately. She has her own system. Clara smiled. It was the smile she had when something was genuinely funny rather than politely funny, which was a different smile entirely, and one that had taken him a while to learn. "What do you want?" she said. Not coyly, just directly. Because that was how she asked everything. "I want you to stay," he said. "Permanently. Officially. You want to marry me?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the table with the focused expression she got when she was thinking something through rather than performing the thinking. "Keep teaching," she said. "I'm not stopping. I know. Pearl's education is not negotiable. I know that too. I'm going to have opinions about the cattle that are going to be wrong, and I'm going to have them confidently, and you're going to need to find a way to correct me without making it a thing. I've managed worse." She looked up. "Have you?" "I have 9 children. I manage wrong, confident opinions approximately 14 times a day." She laughed, the real one, the sudden kind, the one she didn't always let out. "Yes," she said, "I'll marry you." They were married in June, in the yard, because the house was too small for everyone who came, which was not many people, but enough that it mattered. Mercer was there, Harlan Briggs from the livery, 2 families from the county who had become something adjacent to friendly in the months since the adoption. Clara's sister from the eastern part of the state, who looked at Elias with the specific scrutiny of a woman assessing whether her sister's choice was sound, and then apparently decided it was, because she smiled once and went to help Pearl arrange the table. The children were in their best clothes, which was a relative term, but had been taken seriously. Thomas had a collar that he'd buttoned wrong and fixed 3 times and wrong again. The twins were, improbably, dressed identically, which they hadn't been since September Ray's idea, he admitted, for the occasion, which Boyd found either touching or irritating and had decided was touching. Henry had brushed his own hair, which he normally didn't. Pearl stood beside Clara during the ceremony with an expression that was doing several things at once, the managed dignity she defaulted to for important occasions, the specific emotion of a 9-year-old who had been quietly hoping for this since approximately November, and underneath both of those things, something softer and less defended than usual. Nell stood beside Elias. She held his hand throughout. When it was over, she looked up at him and said, with the considered deliberateness of someone deploying an important word, "Good." That was her whole review of the proceedings. He thought it covered it. The summer stretched out long and full. The ranch worked the way a ranch works in summer, harder and longer, and with more light to do it in, which meant more got done, and everyone was more tired. And the evenings had a particular quality of earned rest that is different from any other kind. The table at dinner was loud every night, which was still occasionally startling to Elias, in the way that good things you weren't expecting keep being slightly startling, even after they've been true for a while. Calder turned 13 in July. Elias gave him the pocket watch that had been his father's, not sentimentally, not as a gesture, but practically, because Calder needed a watch, and the watch needed to be used. Calder turned it over in his hands and looked at it, and looked at Elias. "This is yours," he said. "It was my father's, now it's yours." Calder closed his hand around it. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. There was a night in August, late August, kind of night that already has autumn in its edges, if you know how to read them, when Elias was out on the porch. After dinner, and Calder came and sat beside him, the way he'd been sitting beside him since October, 1 year ago on the same porch in different weather. They sat without talking for a while. "It's been a year," Calder said. "Almost September will be a year." Elias nodded. "Do you remember what you were thinking?" Calder said. "When you got off your horse." Elias thought about it. Courthouse steps in the rain, the 9 faces, Nell in the mud, Mercer with his papers. "I wasn't thinking much," he said. "I was reacting." "To what?" "To the look on your face," Elias said. "You'd stopped hoping. You were still fighting, but you'd stopped hoping anyone was coming." Calder was quiet for a long time. "I had," he said. "I'd stopped." "I know. It was the first time I'd let myself stop." He looked at his hands. "I thought maybe if I stopped hoping so hard, Whatever was going to happen would at least happen fast, and we could deal with it. And then a man on a horse got in the way. Calder looked at him sideways. "You were not impressive," he said. "For the record, you were wet and you smelled like cattle, and you had no idea what you were agreeing to." "Still don't," Elias said. "That's not true anymore." Elias thought about it. About what he knew now compared to what he'd known 12 months ago. About the weight of 9 different human beings and what each one needed and how they needed it. The specific geography of their fears and capabilities and the ways they'd changed and the ways they hadn't. "Not as true," he allowed. They sat in the August evening, and the cattle were settled in the pasture, and through the cabin wall came the sound of Clara and Pearl in the middle of what had become their nightly argument about Pearl's correspondence lessons. Pearl wanting more than the schoolmaster had assigned, Clara telling her that wanting more didn't mean doing it all tonight. Pearl countering with the logic of someone who had been born knowing how to construct an argument. The twins were doing something with wood in the addition that had been going on for 3 days, and that Elias had decided to treat as a project until proven otherwise. Henry was in the barn. Thomas was asleep, because Thomas was always asleep by this hour. June and Dot were playing their marble game. Nell pushed open the screen door and came out and positioned herself in Elias's lap without ceremony, the way she'd been doing for almost a year, and she leaned back against him and looked out at the August dark. She still didn't talk in long sentences. She had her own economy of words precise, considered, deployed exactly where they needed to go and nowhere else. Elias had come to understand that this was not a limitation. It was simply how her mind worked and how she communicated, and when she chose to say something, it was worth hearing. She looked at the sky for a while. Then she pointed the same gesture she'd made on the porch that first October night, pointing at the first star. "Same one," she said. He looked. It was the same part of the sky. Whether it was literally the same star, he couldn't say with certainty, but she believed it was, and she had her reasons. "Yeah," he said. "Same one." She nodded and leaned back against him. He thought about what it meant to stop. Not to quit, that was a different thing entirely. To stop in the sense of getting off your horse when something required it. To stop the forward motion of a life that was going somewhere in particular and let the present moment ask something of you. He had been going somewhere in particular for 9 years after Emma died. He'd been going toward a specific version of the future solitary, productive, sufficient, not happy but manageable, not full but not obviously empty. He'd been good at it. He'd gotten very good at not needing things he wasn't going to have. And then a child had fallen in a puddle and sat there, too tired to cry, and he'd gotten off his horse. He didn't think he was a hero for it. He'd thought about this enough times to be honest about it. He hadn't gotten off his horse because he was brave or selfless or because he'd seen clearly what needed to happen. He'd gotten off his horse because in the moment when Nell sat down in that mud, with that particular expression of exhausted resignation, something in him had recognized something in her, and that recognition had been stronger than the inertia of his life up to that point. That was all it was. And from that one unremarkable act, a man getting off a horse in the rain, this had come. Clara's voice through the wall, Calder beside him on the porch. Pearl's argument, passionate and precise. Henry in the barn, Thomas asleep. Boyd and Ray and their endless competition. June and Dot and their marble game. And Nell, leaning against his chest, pointing at stars she'd decided belonged to her. This was what the frontier had taught him. Finally, after 41 years. Not the lesson about hard work or endurance or making do he'd learned those young, and they were true, but they weren't the whole truth. The lesson that had taken him until that rainy September afternoon to learn was simpler and harder. Sometimes the thing that changes your life doesn't look like an opportunity. It looks like an inconvenience. A detour. 9 children, standing in the rain when you were planning to be home before dark. People who keep riding, they're not bad people. Most of them are just people who have learned, through their own losses and their own years, to protect themselves against exactly the kind of cost that loving someone always eventually runs. It's understandable. Elias understood it completely because he had been one of those people. But there is a cost to that protection too. There is a version of a life that is safe and sufficient and slowly, quietly hollow. He had been living it. He'd grown so accustomed to the hollow that he'd stopped hearing it. He could hear it now, in retrospect, the way you hear a sound after it's stopped. The 9 years of silence, the empty chairs, the mornings that were exactly like the morning before. He didn't regret those years. He couldn't afford the arrogance of thinking the grief that produced them had been a waste. Grief is never a waste. It's just the cost of having loved something real. But he was glad, in a way that he felt in his whole body, that he hadn't kept writing, that some instinct in him, something that hadn't completely died in those 9 years of quiet, had made him stop. Nell shifted against him. "Cold," she said. "A little," he agreed. "Inside, in a minute." She accepted this and settled back, and the stars were coming out properly now, the full summer population of them, and the cattle were quiet in the pasture, and the house behind him was full of his family doing the ordinary things that families do in the evening. Calder beside him was 13 years old, with his father's pocket watch in his pocket, and the careful eyes that would always watch, but watched differently now. 1 minute became several, the way good minutes do. Then Nell patted his arm once, twice her signal, which he'd learned in October, and he stood up with her and carried her inside, and the warmth and noise of the house came around them both. And Clara looked up from the table where she and Pearl were still at it, and she looked at Elias with those quick, dark eyes, and the look said, "There you are, and also we're fine," and also several other things that a year of being looked at by her had taught him to read. He set Nell down, and she went directly to her bedroll with the absolute certainty of a child who knows exactly where she belongs, and he sat down at the table, and Pearl immediately redirected her argument to include him as an audience, which Clara noted with narrowed eyes, and the twins came through from the addition to report on their project, which turned out to be a small shelf for Henry's barn tools, which Henry, standing in the doorway, looked at and said good about, which was the highest available praise from Henry, and everyone knew it. Thomas slept through all of it. Calder came in last, from the porch, and he sat in his chair at the table and picked up the book he'd been reading. He always had a book, had been reading his way through everything Elias owned, and had started on Clara's collection, and he opened it. And the lamp was warm, and the stove was banked for the night. Elias looked around the table. He thought about the man he'd been 12 months ago, the one riding into town with a short list and a hard preference for getting home before dark. That man had been alive. He'd been functional. He'd had a good horse and decent cattle and 300 acres that produced well enough. What he hadn't had was this noise, this weight, this daily accumulation of other people's needs pressing up against his own, in the specific way that makes a person larger than they were before. This inconvenient, expensive, relentless, irreplaceable thing. Family. Not the version you're born into, which you don't choose and can't help. The other kind. The kind you stop your horse for. The kind that starts in a courthouse in the rain and ends, if you're lucky, if you're stubborn. If you don't quit when the roof comes off and the money runs short and the county sends a man with papers at a table that's long enough for everyone, with a lamp burning and voices going and 9 people who have written your name on a slate and decided you're theirs. Outside, the August night continued its business. Inside, the house sounded like people. It had taken him 41 years and 1 rainy afternoon to get here. He thought that was probably the right amount of time.